It's 2018, and Indigenous adults continue to be less likely hired and are more likely underhired versus non-Indigenous adults, states a Statistics of Canada report. This video blog is inspired by a Stats Canada report that was written by Jean-Louis Park and presented in their January 18 documentation in an article entitled Overqualification Among Aboriginal Workers in Canada. And in the comments section below, I'll have a hyperlink to the original written blog that I wrote about this topic. And within that written blog, there will be hyperlinks to Jean-Louis Park's original article for those who would like to get into the study, including looking at the methodology, etc. So let's start with the good news and a caveat to the aforementioned headline. Indigenous adults who complete a bachelor degree or higher are in fact less likely to be underhired than non-Indigenous adults. So for those who prevail through systemic and societal barriers to achieve post-secondary education, keep trudging. Society needs you, and you're earning the opportunity to choose between a number of fulfilling career choices. However, this study shows that Indigenous adults with lower than a bachelor degree are more likely to be overqualified for the positions for which they're working thereafter. Now let's have a look at, it's important, I think, contextually to have a look at education achievement levels because it can put some perspective on some of the numbers that we're going to hear about in the balance of this study. And quickly, between 1995 and 2005, there's been a 35% increase in public spending on post-secondary education. This has resulted in an increase from 18% to 33% of employed individuals holding a university degree. Now, this is inclusive of Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. However, Indigenous people are limited in their access to resources and the conditions that would help increase their socioeconomic status. And this study demonstrates some of the educational and economic outcomes of those factors on Indigenous adults. The study reviewed took an extensive sampling. I mean, we're talking about Statistics Canada here. The sample, the descriptor of the sample and the methodology is described in Jean-Louis Park's original report. But in the sample, 20% of Indigenous adults reported that they did not have a high school education, and only 12% were university graduates. Now, this is in contrast to only 9% of non-Indigenous adults having less than a high school education, and 29% of non-Indigenous adults holding university degrees. So there's on the attainment of education levels itself, let's just keep that in the back of our mind. There remains a tremendous disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous adults in Canada. I just want to move for a moment and take a look at something near and dear to a lot of people's hearts right now is what about during economic transitions? And during times of economic transitions like we're in right now, there is a mismatch of people and jobs that increases during such times. And this study looked at aspects of that as well. So I'll just kind of get into that a little bit. So more recently, in terms of this study, more recently to them means the post-2008 recession, not in 2015, because there's quite a lag in the data. But more recently, there are more acute levels of labor market divergence, that being people without jobs or jobs without people. And this is happening as opportunities for certain occupations disappear during transition and employees migrate over to positions for which they are overqualified. So again, we're not even looking at the post-2015 oil price and the anti-development regulatory and political environment that Canada has been facing, which I would argue, and I think a lot would agree, that is even a more severe economic transition than, and it is more transitionary than what was faced in 2008. So in 2011, so 3 years post-2008 recession, 58% of the population with a university degree between the ages of 25 and 34 were working in jobs for which they were overqualified. So this is kind of mapping out what happens post-economic downturn, where there's an increase or a jump in individuals working in jobs for which they're overqualified. And the study concludes, or cites a number of studies which establish that working in jobs for which you are overqualified results in, of course, lower earnings, lower job satisfaction, lower productivity, and it increases the risk of mental health, and it results in a general health decline. And the study also reviewed that due to systemic and societal economic obstacles, Indigenous people are particularly impacted by economic transition. Indigenous adults are, in the first instance, less likely to participate in the jobs market and are more likely to be unemployed, but are even further less likely to be reemployed after an economic downturn. So this is quite concerning, as for example, in 2011, for Indigenous people between the ages of 25 and 64, their employment stats are as follows. First Nation status individuals had 17% unemployment. First Nation non-status peoples had 9% unemployment. Inuit had 17% unemployment, and Métis had 9% unemployment. Now this is in comparison to 6% unemployment of non-Indigenous adults over the same time frame. So in addition, following the recession between the 2008 and 2009, non-Aboriginal labor market participants recovered to a greater degree by 2011. And this study also shows that this is in stark contrast to the post-recession recovery rate of Indigenous workers, which continued to decline. So it's worth pausing for a moment, but the Indigenous population, adult population in Canada, have already taken a hit, and it's a lagging recovery from the 2008, 2009, and even by 2011 they haven't recovered. And in 2015 we're going into another experience another big dip, and we're still not out of it. And the recovery, if it lags, and then Indigenous adults have taken quite a hammering in Canada over the last decade or so. So the conclusion of the study is that Aboriginal adults who attain a university degree or higher education tend to be employed at levels commensurate with that education, and even more so than non-Aboriginal adults. And as we've already discussed, those are, as a percentage, they're more likely hired to be at levels commensurate with the education, but we also are talking about a much lower level of numbers in terms of Indigenous people who achieve a bachelor degree or higher than non-Indigenous adults. So, and then, however, Indigenous adults who obtain education levels below a university degree are typically hired below their qualification level, especially in comparison to non-Indigenous adults. And what must not be overlooked, even though it was not the focus of this study, is the overall lack of sufficient education completion rates and labor market participation rates experienced by Indigenous people as a whole in comparison to non-Indigenous people. What does seem apparent is its subjective job classification and candidate selection factors appear to continue to act against Indigenous candidates. It appears as though that factors less objective that go into classifying a job or selecting a candidate, such as the equivalent experience determinations, appear to be systemically discriminatory against Indigenous candidates versus non-Indigenous candidates. And in a related way, that's about intake in terms of assessing applicants. But the leveling up and promotions that result as a result of tenure on the job and subjective assessments of experience on the job or in the industry also tend to act against Indigenous adults in Canada's workforce in comparison to non-Indigenous adults. How many non-Indigenous adults do we know who are employed at levels that are well beyond their educational expertise, or in fact overemployed for their credentials and experience? If it happens there and it doesn't naturally happen through the course of in the Indigenous population, we need to take a look at why that natural occurrence isn't happening. And what does seem to, from my perspective, what seems to be happening is any factors that are subjective tend to tilt against the Indigenous adult population, and factors that are objective, such as an actual credential or a degree that cannot be ignored, if you will, under those circumstances where those levels are achieved by Indigenous adults tend to thrive. So it appears that only when there's objective criteria that is relied on that cannot be tainted with personal, intentional, or unintentional bias, that is where Indigenous workers tend to thrive, and again, only if they in fact meet that university education or higher level criteria. So more work to be done.